When silence settles between two souls, the mind begins to whisper its oldest fears. In the absence of attention, the unconscious becomes a restless sea, pulling you into its depths, urging you to interpret every gesture, every pause, every space where words should have been. Yet it is exactly in these moments that you must become the observer of your own psyche, not the prisoner of it. Ignored affection awakens ancient archetypes. The wounded serf, the abandoned child, the seeker longing for validation. But allowing these forces to take control leads you onto a path where you lose the most essential thing, your center. The first mistake is surrendering your inner power to external silence. When you allow someone's lack of response to determine your worth, you hand over the authority of your soul. Jung often warned about the danger of projecting your value onto others. When you feel overlooked, the ego immediately seeks confirmation through frantic thoughts, but this is precisely when you must anchor yourself in who you are, not in the reactions of another. Silence from outside must never become noise within. The second mistake is chasing what retreats. The psyche contains both light and shadow, and when you chase, you amplify the shadow within yourself, the fear of loss, the hunger for approval. Chasing creates imbalance. It transforms your authentic desire for connection into a compulsive need to be chosen. The more you pursue, the more you detach from your own center, creating a psychological distance from the parts of yourself that require stability and respect. The unconscious reads this as betrayal of the self. The third mistake is inventing stories to fill the void. The human mind, uncomfortable with uncertainty, begins to fabricate explanations that are far more painful than reality. You imagine intentions, emotions, betrayals, rejections, all products of your own unhealed history. In Jungian thought, this is the projection of your inner wounds on another person's silence. You are not responding to what is happening. You are responding to the unresolved echoes within you. The danger is not in being ignored, but in misinterpreting silence through the lens of past hurt. The fourth mistake is trying to become someone else to regain attention. This is the deepest violation of your individuality. The moment you reshape your personality to attract the gaze of another, you fracture your own psyche. Authenticity is the foundation of individuation, the journey toward becoming your true self. Silence from another must never push you to disown the qualities that make you whole. Changing yourself for attention is a betrayal that the soul does not forget. And the fifth mistake is abandoning your inner voice. In the noise of longing, insecurity, and emotional tension, your intuition becomes faint. You stop listening to the wisdom that has always guided you, the quiet but powerful voice that warns you when something does not align with your spirit. Jung taught that the unconscious speaks through symbols, instincts, and subtle impressions. When you silence this voice to prioritize external attention, you disconnect from the deepest source of your strength. Ignoring your intuition is far more dangerous than being ignored by another. So when silence arrives, do not run from it. Do not collapse under it. Observe it. Understand what it awakens within you. Instead of reacting to what someone else does, respond to what your inner word reveals. Silence is not rejection. It is revelation. It shows you where you are still wounded, where you are still seeking validation, where you are still afraid to stand alone. And in confronting these truths, you do not merely survive the silence, you transcend it. You become the one who no longer fears being ignored, because you are no longer ignoring yourself. When silence arrives from someone you once felt connected to, the psyche reacts in ways that often bypass logic, moving instead through instinct, memory, and emotion. When that silence is misinterpreted as a verdict on your worth, the self becomes destabilized, and the unconscious begins to stir with ancient patterns that you might not even recognize. In moments like these, one of the greatest mistakes is allowing external silence to dictate your inner value, because the psyche has a tendency to project unresolved fears onto the quiet spaces others leave behind. Jung understood that the human being is constantly tempted to place the source of their identity outside themselves, searching for affirmation in the eyes, words, or responses of another. Yet this dependency only strengthens the ego's fragility. When someone withdraws their attention, the ego instantly panics, believing something essential has been taken away. Yet nothing vital can ever truly be taken from you unless you voluntarily hand it over. That is the psychological trap inherent in feeling ignored. The unconscious convinces you that your worth is suddenly negotiable, as if it fluctuates according to how visible you are to another person. This moment activates archetypal fears, particularly the fear of abandonment, which comes from the collective layers of the psyche from ages when being left unseen meant being left unprotected. Although today's emotional landscape is vastly different, the nervous system still reacts with the same urgency it once did in ancestral times. The quietness of another can cause the inner child to awaken, searching desperately for reassurance, seeking proof that it still matters. But the danger arises when you begin to define yourself through the lens of that silence, as though your entire essence could be measured by someone else's temporary absence. Jung would argue that this is when the shadow begins to take over the part of you that fears worthlessness, the part that feels insufficient, the part that believes validation must be earned rather than inherently possessed. The shadow whispers that the silence is a judgment, an assessment of your value, even though silence is often nothing more than a neutral event colored by your internal interpretation. You begin to look outward for answers that can only be found inward. The psyche, when unsettled, seeks control, and one of the first impulses is to question yourself in ways that undermine your inner stability. You may replay your words, your actions, the smallest details of past interaction, searching for a flaw that could explain the absence you feel. This internal interrogation transforms the silence into a mirror reflecting your insecurities rather than reality. In truth, the other person's withdrawal may have nothing to do with you, but when the unconscious is triggered, neutrality becomes nearly impossible to see. The mind fills the void with assumptions because it cannot tolerate ambiguity, and you begin to attach meaning to something that might have no meaning at all. By doing so, you deepen the belief that your worth is fragile, dependent, wavering, capable of rising and falling based on the attention of another. This psychological surrender becomes even more dangerous when you mistake external silence for an internal deficiency. The individual who allows another's behavior to determine their self-image slowly erodes the foundation of their own identity. Jung emphasized that individuation requires grounding yourself in your own nature, becoming whole by reclaiming the parts of you that you once abandoned. But when you give your power to silence, you reverse the individuation process. You begin to fracture your sense of self, prioritizing how you are seen over who you truly are. The feeling of being ignored can create an illusion that you must work harder to be worthy of notice, but this is a distortion of the psyche, not a truth. Your value does not increase when someone pays attention, nor does it decrease when they withdraw. Yet many people unknowingly tie their self-esteem to the ebb and flow of external approval, creating a dependency that causes emotional instability whenever attention fades. Another dimension of this internal struggle is the fragmentation of identity. When you interpret silence as rejection, the ego splits into multiple parts: the part that feels hurt, the part that attempts to rationalize, the part that seeks blame, and the part that grows anxious. These fragments pull you in different emotional directions, weakening your psychological integrity. Jung observed that when people identify too strongly with one emotional part, such as the wounded self, they lose their ability to perceive reality objectively. When you believe that silence means something is wrong with you, you are in essence identifying with a wound rather than with the totality of your being. This leads to emotional inflation, where small events feel disproportionately powerful, and your inner equilibrium becomes dependent on someone else's behavior rather than your own self-knowledge. If you look deeper, you may find that the feeling of worthlessness triggered by silence is not new. It is simply awakening older wounds that were left unresolved. The unconscious uses these moments as opportunities for revelation, showing you where you still doubt yourself, where you still need external approval, where you still abandon your inner authority. Instead of interpreting silence as an attack, you can see it as a reflection of where the psyche still yearns for healing. Shadow work begins here, with acknowledging that your reaction to silence is less about the present moment and more about the unintegrated parts of your past. When you understand this, you begin to reclaim the power you unconsciously gave away. Jung believed that the path to wholeness requires withdrawing projections and recognizing that the meaning we assign to external events often comes from inner sources. When you detach your worth from another's response, you reclaim the energy you once scattered outward. You stop defining yourself through the shifting behaviors of others and begin to anchor yourself in a deeper, more stable foundation. You discover that your worth is intrinsic, not conditional. It is not a currency that fluctuates with someone else's attention. It is the quiet, unshakable truth that exists within the core of your being. But to reach this understanding, you must first resist the temptation to see yourself through the distorted lens of silence. You must recognize that your value does not diminish simply because someone fails to acknowledge it. You must learn to stand in your own presence without seeking confirmation from outside yourself. And in doing so, you begin to free yourself from the unconscious chains that once bound you, allowing your inner voice to rise above the noise, guiding you toward a selfhood that remains whole even when the world grows quiet, and even when attention withdraws, and even when your mind tries to convince you that your worth depends on anything other than the truth of who you are, and even when the silence feels heavy but still cannot define you, because you are far more than the echo of another person's attention, and you are far more than the momentary absence that stirs your insecurities, and you are far more than the temporary space someone creates in your life, because your essence is not shaped by their behavior, but by your willingness to listen to your own depth, instead of the silence outside which continues to remind you that you have always belonged to yourself, even when you forgot, and even when the unconscious shadow tried to pull you back into the old patterns. You are learning to rise beyond even when the psyche trembles in the presence of uncertainty, and even when the fear whispers it illusions, and even when the ego seeks validation. You are discovering how to return to the center of your being, where your worth has always lived, waiting for you to find. Remember that it does not change simply because someone becomes silent, and it does not waver simply because someone looks away, and it does not depend on anything outside you, and it will never be taken from you unless you decide to give it away, even for a moment of attention that can never define who you truly are, because your worth is not a reflection of silence, but a reflection of your own inner truth, which remains untouched even when the world grows quiet, and even when you search for answers outside yourself that can only be found in the depths of your own psyche, where your real strength has always been waiting for you to return to it. And even as you feel the pull of old wounds, you begin to realize that silence from another is nothing compared to the silence within you waiting to be heard. And even as the ego trembles, you begin to awaken to the truth that your value remains whole even when the world offers nothing but quiet, and even when you feel uncertain. You are learning to stand in your own center once again, because the silence outside has no power over the worth that exists within you, even when chasing what withdraws is one of the most subtle psychological traps the human mind falls into, because the moment some pulls away, the unconscious awakens with a primitive urgency to pursue it. This impulse does not come from genuine desire, but from an ancient instinct rooted in fear, scarcity, and the need to restore what feels suddenly threatened. When someone becomes distant, the psyche reacts not to the person, but to the symbolic meaning of that withdrawal. It activates the archetype of pursuit, the longing to regain what feels lost, and the deep-seated fear that something essential has slipped out of your grasp. Yet, in this reaction, something far more significant occurs within you. You begin to move away from your own psychological, sacrificing your equilibrium in an attempt to reclaim a connection that may have never been stable to begin with. The unconscious interprets distance as danger, as a rupture that must be healed through action, yet acting from this place does not restore harmony, it disrupts it. Jung understood that any pursuit driven by fear is a form of inflation, a swelling of the ego that attempts to override uncertainty. You become so focused on what is retreating that you abandon your own self-guided path. The pursuit is not simply physical or emotional, it is symbolic. You chase validation, reassurance, identity, and the illusion that closeness can only be maintained through effort or persuasion. But this pursuit weakens you. It shifts the balance of power, not between you and the other, but within your own psyche, dividing you from your inner authority. Instead of moving from a place of grounded being, you begin moving from a place of psychological hunger. The deeper danger is not in chasing another, but in losing contact with yourself while doing so. When someone withdraws, your instinct may tell you to close the distance, to re-establish connection, to prevent the pain of uncertainty. But if you look closer, you will see that the pursuit stems from an inner fragmentation. One part of you panics, another part tries to control, another part doubts, another part feels abandoned. These parts become louder than your inner voice, drowning out the quiet wisdom that tells you to return to yourself. Chasing amplifies the wounded parts of the psyche, particularly the fear of rejection and the belief that value must be earned through effort. The moment you begin running after someone's attention, you confirm to your unconscious that your worth is dependent on their presence, reinforcing a distorted narrative that you must constantly do something to deserve connection. This disconnection from your center also opens the door to projection. You project your hopes, your fears, your unmet needs onto the person who is pulling away, imagining that if you could only get closer, everything within you would settle. But it is not the person you are really chasing, it is the unresolved longing within your own unconscious. Jung described this as the pursuit of the anima or animus, an inner ideal that you mistakenly believe exists outside you. When the outer figure withdraws, your psyche reacts as though you are losing a part of yourself, even though what you are truly losing is your grip on your own inner balance. You begin to believe that the restoration of wholeness lies in the other, which is an illusion that fragments the psyche even more deeply. Chasing also disturbs the natural flow of psychological energy. When you pursue what retreats, you create tension not only in the external relationship, within your inner life. The more energy you direct outward, the less remains for your own growth, self-observation, and inner development. Jung emphasized that individuation requires turning inward, integrate unconscious material, and forming a stable relationship with the self. But when the psyche is caught in pursuit mode, it disperses energy outward, leaving little for self-understanding. You become consumed by the external object, losing sight of your own needs, desires, and boundaries. You begin to ignore your intuition, override your self-respect, and silence your inner warning signals simply to maintain proximity to someone who has already chosen distance. Beyond this, there is a profound archetypal pattern at work. The more you chase, the more you reinforce the other's withdrawal. Pursuit creates an energetic imbalance. It communicates desperation, insecurity, and self-abandonment, which unconsciously encourages the other to pull away further. The psyche of the pursuer becomes increasingly destabilized, while the psyche of the one withdrawing becomes increasingly detached. This dynamic deepens the wound, causing the pursuer to try even harder, entering a psychological spiral that drains the inner self. Chasing someone who is withdrawing is the ego's attempt to avoid a confrontation with loneliness, inadequacy, or unresolved emotional wounds, but in doing so, it strengthens those very wounds. What makes this dangerous is that the pursuit often feels justified. You convince yourself that you are protecting a connection, nurturing it, keeping it alive, but beneath that justification lies a deeper truth. You are attempting to regulate your own emotional state through someone else's presence. This is the opposite of individuation, which requires learning to hold your own emotional space without depending on external validation. When you chase, you avoid the silence that would force you to meet parts of yourself you have not yet integrated. You avoid the discomfort that could lead to growth. You avoid the introspection that could free you from patterns of dependency. If you step back and examine what truly happens within you during these moments, you may notice that chasing produces more anxiety rather than relief. The more you act from fear, the further you drift from your inner equilibrium. Your thoughts speed up, your emotions intensify, and your clarity diminishes. You become reactive rather than reflective, impulsive rather than grounded. Jung emphasized the importance of observing your inner processes rather than acting through them unconsciously. When you chase, you surrender observation and give control to the most wounded aspects of your psyche. These wounds do not lead, they demand. They push you outward rather than inward, towards someone who's retreating rather than toward the self that is calling for your attention. The deeper truth is that when something withdraws, the healthiest response is not pursuit but stillness. Stillness allows you to see clearly. It allows you to listen to your intuition. It allows you to hold your center, to observe your fears without letting them dictate your behavior. It allows you to recognize that your value is not diminished because someone pulls away. It allows you to reclaim the energy you once directed outward and use it to build a deeper relationship with your own psyche. In this stillness, you discover that chasing was never about the other person. It was about escaping the parts of yourself you have not yet embraced. And when you stop running outward, you finally begin the journey inward, where the real transformation occurs, where your wholeness begins to return, where your center grows stronger, and where you learn to remain anchored in yourself even when something or someone withdraws, and even when the old instincts urge you to pursue, and even when fear tells you that distance is a threat, and even when the unconscious pressure tempts you to abandon yourself to maintain a connection that cannot be forced. And even when every impulse tries to pull you away from your center, you begin to understand that your task is not to chase, but to remain rooted in yourself, where your true power lives, and where your real journey begins. Filling the silence with imagined story is one of the most deceptive movements of the psyche, because the unconscious cannot tolerate emptiness. When someone becomes distant or unresponsive, the external world offers no explanation, and into that vacuum the mind begins weaving narratives from threads of memory, fear, desire, and old wounds. These narratives feel real because they rise from deep regions of the unconscious, where unresolved experiences still exert psychological pressure. Jung understood that when information is missing, the psyche compensates by projecting its own contents outward. Thus, the silence of another becomes a canvas for your inner shadows, a surface on which you paint interpretations that reflect more about your past than your present. The absence of clarity triggers an ancient survival impulse, the need to predict danger. But emotional danger in the modern world is often symbolic rather than literal, and the mind, unable to distinguish between the two, creates stories to protect you from uncertainty, even though those stories may harm you more than the silence itself. The danger lies in the fact that these imagined stories feel like truth. When the psyche projects, it does so with conviction. You begin to believe your interpretations are accurate reflections of another person's intentions, when in reality they are expressions of your own unhealed narratives. The unconscious reacts to triggers, not to facts. It pulls from buried memories, times you felt overlooked, abandoned, dismissed, and overlays those emotions on the present moment. You may assume that the silence means rejection, disapproval, indifference, or betrayal. Not because those meanings exist in the current situation, but because they exist within you. Jung called this process the activation of complexes, emotional nodes, charged with memories and experiences that distort perception. When a complex is activated, you stop seeing reality as it is, and begin seeing it as your wounds remember it. Silence becomes an echo chamber for these wounds, amplifying their voices until they drown out reason. The stories the mind creates can become elaborate, filled with assumptions that escalate emotional turmoil. You may imagine conversations that never happened, intentions that were never expressed, emotions that were never felt. You create motives, explanations, alternate scenarios, all in an attempt to regain a sense of control in the face of ambiguity. But this pursuit of psychological control comes at the cost of inner peace. You become trapped inside narratives that spiral deeper into fear. Instead of observing your emotional response, you become absorbed by it. Jung believed that projection is one of the primary causes of conflict between individuals and within the psyche itself. When you project onto someone who is silent, you engage not with the reality of the present moment, but with the ghosts of the past. You fight battles that do not exist in the present, and you suffer from wounds that are self-inflicted through imagination rather than experience. The mind turns silence into a threat because it fears the unknown. Uncertainty forces you to confront the limits of your control, and the ego detests these limits. The ego thrives on the illusion of knowing, predicting, and defining. When it cannot define what another person feels or thinks, it fills the gap with stories that reaffirm its fears. In this sense, the ego prefers painful certainty over peaceful uncertainty. It would rather believe a self-destructive narrative than accept that it does not know. But the unknown is not dangerous, it is simply unfamiliar. The danger arises when you interpret the unknown through the distorted lens of insecurity. Instead of seeing silence as neutral, you see it as hostile. Instead of allowing space, you fill it with emotional noise. Instead of turning inward for clarity, you turn outward with suspicion. The narratives you create become a labyrinth in which you lose yourself, wandering through fears that appear real only because you breathe life into them. These imagined stories also distance you from your intuition. Intuition arises from a deeper, quieter layer of the psyche, one that perceives truth without distortion. But when the mind is overwhelmed by imagination driven by fear, intuition becomes drowned out. You may feel a soft inner nudge telling you to remain grounded, to trust the process, to stay centered, but the louder voices of insecurity overpower it. Jung taught that the unconscious contains both wisdom and chaos, and the task of the individual is to discern between them. The stories born from fear are chaotic, they pull you away from yourself. Intuition, however, calls you back to your center, but to hear it, you must create space within, not fill every silence with imagination. When you allow fears to speak louder than intuition, you become misaligned with your inner truth, and your actions follow the distortion rather than clarity. Projection also damages relationships, not just internally but externally. When you assume motives, emotions, or judgments that have not been expressed, you behave according to those assumptions. You may pull back, grow resentful, act defensively, or attempt to force clarity through anxious communication. These reactions create tension, misunderstanding, and further emotional distance. Ironically, the stories your mind creates can become self-fulfilling prophecies. The fear of being ignored leads to behavior that pushes connection even further away. Jung's work repeatedly emphasized the importance of withdrawing projection, because they cloud perception and interfere with authentic relating. When you see someone not as they are, but as your wounds imagine them to be, genuine connection becomes impossible. You interact not with the person, but with the story you've created, becoming trapped in a psychological loop where your fears generate behaviors that reinforce those same fears. To break this cycle, you must learn to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. The ego resists this because uncertainty feels like vulnerability. But it is in this vulnerability that psychological growth begins. When you choose not to fill silence with imagined stories, you create space for reflection rather than reaction. You begin to observe your emotions rather than obey them. You start to recognize which thoughts arise from fear and which come from intuition. You notice patterns, triggers, and emotional echoes. This awareness is the beginning of individuation. Instead of projecting your inner world outward, you turn inward to understand it. You begin to question your assumptions, challenge your fears, and reclaim your psychological energy. You learn to allow silence to exist without defining it, without interpreting it, without letting it disrupt your inner balance. As you grow in self-awareness, silence becomes less threatening. It no longer activates complexes with the same intensity. The unconscious becomes less reactive because you have begun integrating the wounded part of yourself that once demanded projection. You stop creating stories not because the silence becomes easier, but because you have become stronger. You trust yourself more. You rely less on external cues to determine your emotional state. You understand that silence from another person is not a judgment, not a rejection, not a reflection of your worth. It is simply a moment in time, neutral until your mind assigns meaning to it. And when you no longer rush to fill that space with fear, you begin to experience a psychological freedom that was always waiting beneath the noise, and always waiting beneath the projections, and always waiting beneath the stories your mind once created to protect you from a silence that never had the power to hurt you unless you gave it that power, and always waiting beneath the fears that rise when clarity is missing, and always waiting beneath the restless imagination that tries to explain what you have not yet learned to sit with, and always waiting beneath the instinct to assume instead of observe, and always waiting beneath the urge to escape uncertainty rather than understand it, and always waiting beneath the unconscious patterns that once controlled your perception, always waiting beneath the narratives you told yourself to avoid the stillness that now calls you inward, where your real clarity begins to take shape, and where your inner truth begins to emerge, and where your projections begin to dissolve, and where silence begins to lose its power to deceive, because you are beginning to recognize that the stories you once created were never reflections of reality, but reflections of parts of yourself asking to be seen, and asking to be understood, and asking to be integrated, and asking to be healed, and asking for you to finally stop running from the unknown, and stop filling the silence with illusions, and stop abandoning your inner truth whenever the outer world grows quiet, and asking you to return to the center of your being where your clarity waits. Even now, changing yourself to regain attention fractures your authenticity, because the moment you begin altering your natural expression in response to someone's withdrawal, you abandon the inner path that Jung described as the foundation of individuation. When you shift your behavior, your tone, your interests, or your emotional rhythm in an attempt to re-attract someone's focus, you are no longer acting from the self, but from the ego's fear of losing connection. This fear-driven transformation is not evolution, it is distortion. The psyche senses rejection, and instead of confronting the wound directly, it tries to mask it by reshaping the personality into something more palatable, more impressive, more compliant, or more desirable. Yet every adjustment made for external approval pulls you further from your inner truth, weakening the integrity of your identity. The unconscious registers this self-abandonment, and each time you compromise who you are for attention, the psyche becomes less cohesive, less grounded, and more fragmented. The desire to change yourself in these moments does not arise from strength but from insecurity. When attention fades, the ego interprets it as evidence of inadequacy, as though something within you must be fixed, enhanced, or hidden. This internal conclusion forms quickly and often silently as the unconscious activates old patterns of pleasing, adapting, or performing patterns created in childhood or earlier moments of emotional vulnerability. These patterns arise automatically, convincing you that by adjusting your identity you will regain the closeness that feels threatened. Jung would call this a regression, a movement away from your mature, individuated self and back into earlier developmental states where worthiness seemed conditional. You behave as though your value must be negotiated, shaped, or proven. Forget that true worth remains constant, regardless of who sees it or fails to see it. In this regression, the persona becomes inflated. The persona, the social mask you wear, begins taking control, altering your behavior to meet imagined expectations. You may soften your opinions, mute your emotion, exaggerate your charm, diminish your boundaries, or adopt interests that do not belong to you. You may pretend indifference when you feel longing, confidence when you feel insecurity, ease when you feel tension. Each performance deepens the divide between the persona and the true self, creating an inner conflict that drains psychological energy. The more you perform, the more you lose sight of who you genuinely are. And the more you lose sight of yourself, the more dependent you become on external cues to determine how you should act, speak, or feel. This is the opposite of individuation. Instead of moving toward wholeness, you move toward fragmentation. What makes this dynamic even more dangerous is that the changes you make are not grounded in intentional growth, but in fear. Fear-driven change is unstable because it is reactive rather than reflective. It does not arise from genuine insight or self-awareness, but from the impulse to avoid emotional discomfort. When you reshape yourself to secure attention, you reinforce the belief that who you naturally are is insufficient. This belief becomes embedded in the unconscious, shaping future behavior and weakening your inner authority. Jung emphasized that every time you betray your authentic self, the shadow gains strength. The shadow stores all the parts of you that you reject, hide, or suppress in order to be accepted. And when the shadow becomes too large, it erupts through anxiety, resentment, emotional exhaustion, or sudden eruptions of anger or sadness, because the psyche cannot sustain a life lived through pretense. Another layer of this struggle is the loss of boundaries. In the effort to regain connection, you may loosen your standards, tolerate disrespect, silence your needs, or allow behaviors you would never accept under ordinary circumstances. This erosion of boundaries is a manifestation of inner disempowerment. When the fear of being ignored becomes stronger than your self-respect, you drift into conformity, allowing external forces to shape your identity. Jung believed that the self, the deepest center of the psyche, guides you through intuition, instinct, and inner knowing. But when you prioritize external approval over inner alignment, the voice of the self becomes faint. You begin operating not from your own truth, but from the imagined desires of another. Your life becomes a performance, and your emotional world becomes unstable, because no authentic foundation supports the identity you present. Moreover, changing yourself to regain attention creates an illusion of control. You may believe that by adjusting your behavior, you can influence how someone perceives you. But this illusion is brittle and exhausting because it places your emotional well-being in the hands of someone else's unpredictable reactions. You lose autonomy, not because someone took it from you, but because you abandoned it in the hope of receiving affirmation. This pattern reinforces the unconscious belief that your worth is externally sourced, which leads to chronic emotional dependency. Your mood begins to fluctuate based on the presence or absence of attention, leaving you vulnerable to instability whenever someone withdraws. Jung warned that dependency on external validation drains the psyche of courage, authenticity, and inner strength, creating a cycle in which you feel increasing pressure to maintain a persona that is not truly yours. As you reshape yourself repeatedly, your intuition becomes muted. Intuition tells you when something is misaligned, when your boundaries are being crossed, when your energy is being misused, when your authenticity is slipping. But when the drive to regain attention becomes dominant, you suppress these intuitive signals. You override your inner truth in favor of the external narrative you are trying to maintain. The more you ignore intuition, the more disconnected you become from your inner world, and the disconnection leads to emotional confusion, self-doubt, and a sense of inner emptiness. Jung described this emptiness as a symptom of living too far from one's own soul. The soul, the true self, cannot thrive in a life shaped by fear, pretense, or self-abandonment. There is also a profound inner grief that emerges when authenticity is compromised. At a deep level, the psyche knows when you have betrayed your own truth. Even if you regain temporary attention through these changes, the cost is immense. You feel disconnected from yourself, anxious about maintaining the performance, and fearful that if you stop pretending, you will lose everything again. This emotional state is unsustainable. The more you abandon yourself, the more the psyche demands reconciliation. The inner conflict intensifies, pushing you toward a breaking point where you must choose between continuing the performance or returning to your authentic self. Jung taught that the soul rebels when it is suppressed. It sends signals: fatigue, anxiety, sadness, numbness, to alert you that you have wandered too far from your true path. When you begin returning to authenticity, something shifts.